Is it on? Is it working? Is it working? Okay. Or should I start yelling? See if I can make a mess out of this thing. Okay. Now I feel armed and dangerous here. We looked at that first parable, the conclusion to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And you can't really look at that parable unless you, you can't seriously look at that parable unless you consider the Sermon on the Mount. And so, we got this handy-dandy chalkboard here, and we're going to put some of those. What does the rock as a foundation, what is incorporated in that, and what's incorporated in the sand? Well, this thing moves, doesn't it? Okay, what are some of the things that Jesus was talking about? He introduces this Sermon on the Mount with what we call the Beatitudes. Now, I think when you look at these Beatitudes, and then after you get past that, and then you start looking at you're the salt of the earth, you're the light of the world, and then all the other stuff, you could fit all this other stuff into the Beatitudes. Somewhere into one of those categories that Jesus talks about: poor in spirit, those who mourn, gentle, those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. And when you think about this foundation that Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 7, the conclusion to the Sermon on the Mount, as it's called, he begins it by saying, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man," that's in verse 24 of chapter 7, "who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against the house, and it didn't fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell. And great was its fall." So, he's talking about two different things here. He's talking about two different foundations and two different types of builders. And we looked at the types of builders, and we looked at the types of foundations, and we started to get into all the builders are tested according to this outline that's prepared here. But I'd like to get through this parable, by the way, tonight anyway. I mean, 2 Thursdays, I think we should be able to exhaust what we can exhaust out of this and learn what we can learn from this. But I got to thinking about, okay, well, what's the rock and what's the sand? Everybody says, okay, well, the rock is Jesus. Well, yeah, the rock is Jesus. But what is it about Jesus that we need to know about, or we need to pay attention to? We look at verse 24 of chapter 7. The first part of that first sentence is, or the first part of the sentence, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them." And I was kind of sitting on my patio early one morning, and I hear this car go by, and I hear this thing thud in the driveway, and I go, that's the paper boy, the paper guy driving by. And I thought about that, and I go, okay, yeah, this guy's made out of paper driving the car, or it's a sheet of paper with a stick figure drawn on it driving the car. And I'm just thinking, well, words are really important. We've got to pay attention to words and how they're used and how we're supposed to examine things, because I got a wild imagination at times, and I have to be very careful because I can think all kinds of crazy stuff. So I got to thinking about, well, what's in that rock? I mean, we're thinking, okay, well, we know that the foundation is Jesus. But it's Jesus' words that are important. We're going to be judged by His words. In John chapter 6, and I believe it's verse 68, or 63, I can't remember which. No, it's 68. When Jesus says some difficult things and everybody bails on him, he asks a question. He asks the 12, he says, "Do you want to go away also? Do you?" And Simon Peter answered him and says, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have words of eternal life." And Jesus states it real clearly here in Matthew chapter 7. Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them can be compared to a wise man. And then on the other side of the coin, he says, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like the foolish man who built his house on the sand. But I would say that getting back to that initial, what is incorporated into this parable? What is the rock? It's Jesus, but it's all these things that he talks about. The Beatitudes, it's the poor in the spirit, it's those who mourn. I mean, these are all of the minerals that compose that rock. And also these attributes, I mean, there's both of these builders are pretty much the same, except when you get down to the application of doing what's right and what's wrong. I mean, both when you look at them, they both hear, they're both attentive, they both hear the words that Jesus has to say. It's just how they act on those words of Jesus that makes the difference. So all of these things are part of that rock and part of these builders. Jesus is the rock, but all these things come from Jesus. And it's how the builders incorporate that. And we are builders as well.
I guess just understanding, his main point has to deal with this idea of wisdom. There's a big difference between knowing something and doing it. I mean, it's like James says in James 1:22, be doers of the word and not only hearers who delude themselves. The basic idea, Jesus comes out, you got two builders, they both probably know how to build a house, they know what you're supposed to do with the house, but only one of them actually had the good sense to put the house in a place that was good for building. And it's not like either one of them is totally ignorant of this, but he says, okay, see, you're builders, you know what to do, but instead you're building a beach house for yourself and whatnot. You're getting all kinds of trouble.
Now you guys, I don't know how many of you watch the Weather Channel, but they have these storm stories and, these houses wash away and stuff. We used to live in the desert, and there was this river that went through the desert. Believe it or not, there was a river there, but it flowed upside down and backwards. It flowed from south to north, and the water was all underground most of the time, unless it rained a whole lot. And there was this development outside of Victorville, California, called Spring Valley Lake, and it was on the edge of this Mojave River. It's a couple hundred yards away from it, but it's all on sand, it's all on fill. And when you get an El Nino year and you get a whole bunch of rain, well, that stuff erodes. And you look in the newspaper the next day and you watch the news, there's these houses that are tipped into it, and just thinking, well, yeah, that wasn't a real smart place to build a house now, was it? Not very prudent. And that's the comparison that Jesus is making here. Prudence. But anyway, there is a contrast between the rock and the sand, okay? One's firm, one's not. One's solid, one's not. One's good, one's bad. There's a contrast in these builders. Although they're very similar, they're different. I used to have a customer that come in, he'd build houses and we do the trusses for him, but he'd bring in these plans and he'd say, it's the same thing, only different. And we learned real quick that it's really not the same thing. It is completely different, but you think it's the same thing, only different. But for us, it was way different. It's paying attention to the words and paying attention to the details and applying things that makes us successful in anything. In particular, our spiritual lives. Any comments or?
Another thing that comes to mind, is this is not the only contrast he offers in this chapter. Really,
everything's a bunch of contrasts.
Really, from verse 13 onwards, enter through the narrow gate. You have a choice between two gates. You can either go through the the narrow gate, or you can go through the broad gate, the wide gate that leads to destruction. You have a choice between two trees, the trees that bear good fruit and the trees that bear bad fruit. And this statement, even in verses 21 through 23, I think Jesus is setting them up for the parable with this contrast between a person who says, Lord, Lord. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven. But what? But the one who does the will of my Father.
Well, yeah.
It's not just about what you're saying. Well, it's not just about what you say, it's about what you do.
Well,
it's not just about what you hear.
It's obvious what he's building up to with this parable. Actually, if you go back to chapter 5 and start in verse 13, he talks about you're the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, what good is it? You're a light of the world. And, well, if the light's under a basket, what good is it? I mean, it's pretty consistent. But all of those things that he talks about are incorporated in that rock, and then all of those things that are contrasting are in the sand. Yes, sir, Keith?
We just walked in, but just keep in mind that these are not literal houses.
Spiritual houses.
And it says to us that we all need a house to live in. We live in these bodies He's given us. And life itself is a structural process. As we build our lives, our foundation should have Christ as its base. Because all of us live in these houses, these temples, in some places they're called. And it depends on how we love it, how much we love it determines how well we take care of it. And actually, according to scriptures, we should love God more than anything else in this world.
With all of our heart, and with all of our soul, and with all of our mind. When you mention that Jesus is the foundation, what does that mean? Because Jesus takes it in chapter 7, he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So it's that will, those words, what Jesus has to say. This thing kind of goes up and down, doesn't it? But Jesus is the foundation, but
no house can stand without a foundation.
no, it can't.
No house can stand.
No, it can't.
Structure cannot survive the storm without a foundation.
I mean, that's the point that Jesus is making in this parable. But with all of this Sermon on the Mount, prior to that parable, he's describing what makes up Jesus, basically, what makes up to be part of that rock, Jesus, because there's a whole bunch of people, Jesus even says so, that are saying, I love you, Jesus. I love you. All I got to do is believe, and I'm going to heaven. I mean, there's a whole bunch of, I mean, that path is, I don't know how wide that path is, but it's a whole lot wider than that narrow path. And then he, prior to his parable, he says, therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine, well, these words of his are this sermon. These are the attributes that make up Jesus, the rock. Those things that those who want to be on that narrow path have to incorporate it into their lives. Like Keith was mentioning, that foundation. Otherwise, we're the builder who's building on the sand. And sand don't cut it.
And when the pressures of life come down upon us.
Yeah, that's a good point. When the pressures of life come down, you just get washed away instead of being right there on that rock. Yes, sir.
Well, I mean, I guess the other thing that comes to mind in just reading this is, throughout this sermon, Jesus has been inviting comparison with this group of people who, well, he names them up front, the scribes and the Pharisees, unless your righteousness surpasses them, you won't enter me. And then from then on out, throughout chapter 6, he's referring to them as the hypocrites. Don't pray like the hypocrites. Don't give alms like the hypocrites. Don't fast like the hypocrites. Well, what's a hypocrite? A hypocrite is a person who says one thing and does another.
I thought it was a type of animal. Hypocrite?
No, that's a hippopotamus.
Oh, okay.
The fact of the matter is that, we can claim something for ourselves all we want. We can, I'm sure that there are people who, I guess if we're going to push this analogy further, they're building the proverbial house, and it's like, well, I've stamped the name of Jesus in my foundation, which I guess equivocates to them writing it out in the sand, but, well, that doesn't make it so. It's not a rock. It's not going to change.
That's true. Now, you notice something else about this Sermon on the Mount that as he goes on through it, he talks about making friends with your opponent at law. He talks about plucking out your right eye if it offends you, or removing a limb if it offends you. Now, we can assume that means that, those things that are offensive to God within our lives, we best get rid of them. Even if I would assume even if it's literal, get rid of them. But I'm just curious as to why he put this in here when you have the Beatitudes, then you have you're the salt of the earth, you're the light of the world. Then he talks about annulling any of the commands. You'll be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And then he gets into this dialogue of legality, legal issues. Any idea why, or any thoughts why?
Chunk of it is, are you referring to the legal issues in chapter 5?
Yeah.
I'd say there's a good chunk of it stems from that statement, I've not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill.
Right.
What does it mean to fulfill the law? Well, it means you actually do not just what the law said, but what the law meant when it said it. The law said don't murder. Well, there's a lot more to not murdering, as it turns out, than simply not killing somebody. He tries to bring things, I think, inward, an internal place, looking at them. Adultery, it's primarily an internal problem that begins in the heart. Murder is an internal problem that begins in the heart. And the same thing with external rituals that you do. Unless they're done from the heart, then you're just another hypocrite, he says.
Yeah. Now, when Jesus is...
It's connected together, anyway.
Yeah. When Jesus is dealing with the Pharisees and the scribes in Matthew chapter 23, how is he talking to them, and what is some of the context of that? He tells the audience first, do what they say, but don't do what they do. He calls them hypocrites. But in a lot of ways, the Pharisees and the scribes should have been paying attention to this, because a lot of this is stuff that Jesus addresses with them later on, too. But it's also for our learning as well. It's all relevant. He talks about in chapter 6, beware of practicing your righteousness before men, to be noticed by them, otherwise you have no reward with your Father in heaven. In verse 5, he says, when you pray, you're not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, that they may be seen by men. And then in the middle of this chapter, he talks about, for if you forgive others for their transgressions, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you don't forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions. And then he gets into a dialogue that kind of hits the Pharisees right in the head. Whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face as the hypocrites do. Who does he address as hypocrites? Pharisees and the scribes. But they neglect their appearance that they will be noticed by men when they're fasting. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. Which path are they on? The wide one or the skinny one? Yeah. We got to be careful. We're not on the wide one. Any comments or questions? I kind of lost my train of thought on that last question that I had, so I do apologize.
Just bringing it all back to where we are with the parable in terms of building our house on the rock versus building our house on the sand. I mean, you know, Jesus isn't saying anything that would have been quote unquote new. I mean, he's giving a new understanding to it. But by and large, you could have read your Old Testament and come to the same conclusion that Jesus is spelling out for them. I mean, you read the Psalms, blessed is the one who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. You know, blessed is the very first Psalm is, blessed is the person who doesn't do the bad things. Cursed is the one who does do the bad things. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. They have two paths that are being walked on. Two foundations. And I mean, so there's a sense in which Jesus is really just taking ideas from Old Testament wisdom literature and sort of, you know, adapting them to his audience and saying, look guys, it's simple. Do the good things, don't do the bad things.
And that's a good point. The other thing he does is he takes these things that these guys knew to be law, but it's just a do it on a physical basis, and he made it into a attitude basis, spiritual basis for these laws. Don't murder. But I say to you, whoever looks on someone, you know, with hatred, you're murdering them. Don't commit adultery. But I say whoever's looking after a woman with lust has already committed adultery. So he's taking it to where you gotta put it in here and think about what you're doing. I mean, think about what you're thinking. And I think that's why that stuff's right there in the middle of this, because it focuses towards the personal basis of things. And then when he continues and he's talking about fasting and putting on a gloomy face and store up treasure for yourself in heaven, not on earth. Mark?
My brain isn't firing on all synapses tonight, so pardon me if I'm repeating something that's already been said. Jesus here is not contrasting the law of Moses with his law. The law of Moses didn't say any of this stuff. Jesus said, you have heard it said. Now the scribes and the Pharisees did not teach the law of Moses. They taught their interpretation of the law of Moses, which was, well, as long as I didn't swear by the gold in the temple, I don't have to keep that promise I made, because I only swore by the temple. That wasn't what the law of Moses said. In the law of Moses, oftentimes we get this picture that the law of Moses was a law of action, and the law of Christ is a law of heart, and nothing can be further from the truth. God had to set forth a codified system of the Israelites living together, and so he gave them a lot of these laws of action, but the Old Testament was every bit as concerned with the heart. What was the great commandment with promise? Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Upon those two hang the whole law of Moses. That was the beginning of it.
The whole law and the prophets.
Moses was the law of the heart, just like the law of Christ.
Yeah.
And Christ is actually getting them back to what Moses said to them in the beginning right here.
So, is that why Jesus called them hypocrites? Yeah. Well, in a sense, we can become so caught up in our traditions and things that we could be considered hypocrites at times too. We could be in danger of that, couldn't we? You had your hand up, Wayne?
Well, yeah. I mean, just kind of bouncing off what was just said. You know, the New Testament talks quite a bit about how love is the fulfillment of the law, and sometimes both commandments are cited. Sometimes just love your neighbor as yourself is cited, which I'm personally in the mindset that, you know, really both are meant when that's said in places. You know, Jesus does this too. In all of these you have heard it said statements, he builds up to the climactic one in verse 43. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Well, I mean, if you go back to Leviticus 19:18, hate your enemies nowhere in that text. In fact, and you go a little bit further into the chapter, it talks about how you're not only to love your neighbor, you're supposed to love the foreigner as yourself as well. I think that's verse 30 or 32 or something like that. But Jesus comes around and he says, no, that's wrong. He says, God said, love your neighbor, and that includes your enemies. He says, I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And, he goes off on that. That's really the climactic statement and the fulfillment of the law right there.
So you think that possibly all of that you could fit right into all that stuff that's called the Beatitudes? Well, with the exception of the blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of my name, but
the degree to which this whole sermon is an exposition of that commandment right there. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. What does that really mean? I mean, even in chapter 7 verse 12 in particular, treat those as you would have them treat you. Why? Because this is the law and the prophets. Again, it's the same thing. It keeps coming back to.
Indeed. Any other comments? Okay, we've got, looks like about 10 minutes and we've got a little bit to get through here. If you don't mind, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and we're finishing up Roman numeral 3 here. All builders are tested. We understand that all men are builders. Everybody's building something. What are we building and where are we building it? Spiritually speaking. And we all have choices of two different foundations. Jesus or something else. The rock, Jesus and His words, or Jesus and something else. Could be said that way, or not Jesus, something else. A lot of people profess, like I mentioned earlier, Jesus as their personal Savior. They touch a TV and send $100 to a preacher and they think they're saved. They believe, as John 3:16 says, and they go on thinking that they're saved. Is that a foundation or a builder issue? Or both? We have to be very careful too. If we're not studying to show ourselves approved, we can fall right into that category too. And all builders will be tested. Especially those who build their faith upon Jesus. If we're not being tested, we haven't built our faith. I would suggest that. The Bible speaks to that. And Roman numeral number 4 here, only one building will stand. As the parable says, the house of the wise man didn't fall, for it had been founded on the rock. But the house of the foolish man fell, and great was its fall. It was pronounced a great fall for at least 3 different reasons. Because of the suddenness of it. It wasn't just a decline, it was a crash. Because of the completeness of it, it wasn't a partial fall, but it was a complete fall. And because of the finality of it. You notice the Bible doesn't indicate that the house was ever rebuilt. Where are we putting our foundations? And we're down to this class discussion. Any comments or questions or... Yeah, I'm going to get through it. I hope. Okay, after all this discussion for 1 3/4, 1 7/10 class periods, in your own words, tell the story of the parable and how it may relate to you or I. No. Now here's all the people on earth. How many people are on earth now? About 7 billion or so. And Jesus says everybody's a builder. The parable says that. Everybody's building something. All men are builders. How many different types of builders does Jesus say there are? 2. And why? Why is there only 2 types of builders?
Either right or you're wrong.
Yeah. Are you building your house on that rock?
Not 50 Shades of Grey or...
Nope. You notice there isn't any busted up concrete in between there? There's not. In the desert there was this hard stuff that you couldn't get a shovel through unless you soaked it for about a month or so. It was called caliche. But when you had a seismic event, that stuff kind of turned into chunks of whatever it was, but it wasn't very good. You didn't want to use that for a foundation. You know, you still want to dig your footings and pour your concrete and then pour your slab and build your house on it. Same with this. The foundation is Jesus. Then you build your house on that. What do you build your house out of? The words of Jesus. Then when it's tested, it doesn't fall. So with that, let's describe the wise builder and the foolish builder. Everybody's one or the other.
The wise builder is wise, the foolish builder is.
Indeed.
He leans on to his own understanding.
The proverb writer says that, yeah. Are you ever guilty of leaning on your own understanding? No, not you, Wayne. you had a comment, Keith. I'm sorry.
Say the overarching lesson that the 2 builders teach us is that they both need a house. We all need a house. We all need some place to live.
That's a good point.
And some people live in palaces. Some people live in mansions. There are all types of houses. There are only 2 types of builders. One is wise, builds his house on sure foundation. That's one of the lessons. We all need a house. And
That's
life
true.
is a structural process. Forgiveness of sin is made available to us through Christ. And we're always going to need it.
Yep.
We're always going to need it. Because we can sin in our thinking, as Jesus pointed out.
Yep.
You know, the Old Testament couldn't heal our conscience.
That's
It
true.
didn't address the conscience. It took Jesus to come and address our thinking about sin. Because if we can intervene at the earliest possible time when it is conceived, then we have a better opportunity to overcome it or to not succumb to it.
That's true. We've got to recognize it and deal with it, though. That's the idea. If we got that foundation on the rock, it'll stand up to it'll stand up to the seismic events, to the water, to the wind, to whatever comes at it. It'll stand up to the wiles of the devil.
The Hebrew writer says, with the temptation, the Lord will provide a way of escape. But see, we have to choose to take that escape. There's the choice. We have to choose to take the way out.
Yes, sir, we do.
Because he doesn't force it on us.
Yes, sir, we do. I appreciate the class. There goes the bell. I appreciate the...
Florida, or just by having a house here? I'm just wondering.
Well, it's built on sand.
Pretty much much the whole state is doomed according to this paragraph.
Well, yeah, but your foundation is concrete, which is an aggregate that's a lot like rock. But anyway, thank you. Is there any other comments, or are we basically done with this? And Keith, thank you, and thank the rest of the class. I appreciate the study.